Plenty live for this massive crowd we have here tonight. Just screaming crowd. Welcome everyone to a new frontier of know thyself and know thy neighbor. You know me, I'm Pastor Matthew, and I am here at your congregation, your church, St. Andrew Lutheran Church, with a massive crowd. I mean, we are talking the largest crowd that I have ever seen in this sanctuary. It happens to be me and Steve and Nancy Hagen sitting right next to me. But I know we have a bunch of you who are joining us online, and we are even more grateful for our guest and for the amazing gift of technology that Dr. Todd Green can join us all the way from God's country down in Decorah, Iowa. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Todd Green, who is up here on our screen. Good to see you, Todd. Todd is a professor of religion. Dr. Todd Green is a professor of religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. He was a Franklin Fellow at the U.S. State Department in 2016 and 2017 and has been a public scholar who's been contributing articles and interviews on such publications as CNN, NPR, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole list more as well, Todd. He is the author of The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West, which was published by Fortress Press. And perhaps most intriguing to our crew here, Dr. Todd Green was a contributor and actually helped to create and format a resource that Lutheran Social Services of Minnesota created a number of years ago called My Neighbor is Muslim, which was a resource for congregations to discuss and learn about our Muslim neighbors. Dr. Todd Green helped create this with St. Andrew's own member and prop local development director, Pastor Mary Brown. So we are grateful, and our enormous crowd here tonight is going to clap our hands as we introduce Dr. Todd Green. So let's make Dr. Green feel real at home in our space. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the grand round of applause. And thanks for having me tonight. I apologize, my voice is a little hoarse. I'm wrestling with allergies right now, and tis the season to do that for me. So just bear with me if I get harder to understand as this goes on. Hopefully it won't be too bad. But I'm excited about engaging with you tonight and give a brief overview of this topic I'm calling Assuming the Best of Our Muslim Neighbors, and hope we have a very good conversation to follow. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'll jump right into it. Excuse me. I believe that Islamophobia represents one of the greatest moral dilemmas of our time. Anti-Muslim hatred and hostility that is driven by racism has manifested itself in exclusionary, discriminatory, and violent actions towards Muslims and towards those who are perceived as Muslim. By most metrics, Islamophobia in the United States has only gotten worse since 9/11. This includes record levels of anti-Muslim hate crimes in 2016 and 2017 in particular, which reflected the highest numbers of hate crimes targeting Muslims since the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. But this also includes the targeting of Muslims in other ways when we measure Islamophobia, such as the Muslim ban that took effect back in 2018, and which, according to Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, was driven by, quote, hostility and animus toward the Muslim faith. Other forms of systemic discrimination against Muslims persist, including mosque surveillance, airport profiling, and anti-Sharia legislation in over a dozen states. Muslims are also subjected to heated political rhetoric and discriminatory proposals during election cycles, as we witnessed back, particularly in the 2015-2016 presidential election cycle. Prominent presidential candidates back in 2015 and 2016 flirted with proposals for Muslim ID cards, Muslim registration systems. They called for the patrolling of Muslim neighborhoods, and one candidate insisted that, quote, Islam hates us. These examples, combined with discrimination and violence aimed at Muslim communities in other Western nations, including, for example, deadly attacks on mosques in Quebec in 2017 and in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, All of these are reminders that Muslims are under siege, near and far. We will not see any significant reversal of these trends until Christians, I should say, actually take the lead in countering Islamophobia and in building bridges with our Muslim neighbors. But if we are honest, I think we must acknowledge that Christians are behind in this work. Some of this has to do with the fact that certain segments of white Christian America are actively instigating Islamophobia and encouraging anti-Muslim hostility, which means intra-faith engagement must also become central to our anti-Islamophobia efforts. But it also has to do with a persistent hesitancy that I encounter in many Christian communities, including but not limited to Lutheran congregations, about how best to reach out to our Muslim neighbors in a way that both cultivates authentic relationships and challenges anti-Muslim narratives and discrimination. Some of this hesitancy may be driven by Lutheran clergy or lay leaders who express doubts about their ability to engage in this work because they don't have much of a knowledge of Islam. So this is part of the ongoing challenge. But when it comes to Muslims, for all of us, and particularly in Christian communities, clergy and lay people alike, two moral questions stand before us as we think about this work from a Christian perspective. Two questions. First, what are our commitments to our Muslim neighbors? This is a question driven by Jesus' command to love our neighbors. The second question, how do we tell truths about our Muslim neighbors? A question that's driven by the ancient biblical commandment not to bear false witness. Both questions suggest that loving our neighbors and telling truths about our neighbors, whoever they are not peripheral to the gospel, but constitute its core. And the age of cruelty and lying that I think we live in right now, Christians have a sacred obligation and certainly a moral obligation to do better by our Muslim neighbors. So the question now remains, how do we do better? How do we engage our Muslim neighbors with more compassion and with more honesty? And that's the topic I want to address with you this evening. That said, the task is not easy that lies before us. Our view of Muslims in the United States and the majority population, and including amongst Christians, has been distorted by centuries of political and theological antagonisms. Today, too many of us operate under the assumption that Muslims, by default, are prone to violence, that Muslims practice a religion that oppresses women, that Muslims want to rid the nation of democracy and impose something called Sharia. And we have allowed these prejudices and these shallow tropes and stereotypes to go unchecked and to cloud our judgment. So in short, we are guilty in many quarters of the Christian community of assuming the worst of our Muslim neighbors, and this hinders our efforts to engage with Muslims in a healthy and productive manner. So we can do better. We have to do better. We have the capacity to assume the best of our Muslim neighbors and not the worst. What we need, however, is an interfaith blueprint to help us with this task, to help us cultivate compassion toward and honesty with Muslims. This evening, I will discuss 3 rules of interfaith engagement, very briefly, that offer such a blueprint. I think that offer a promising blueprint. I am borrowing these rules from the late Christopher Stendahl. Stendahl was a biblical studies scholar, dean at Harvard Divinity School, and a Lutheran bishop in the Church of Sweden, all before he passed away. The rules of interfaith engagement that he created hold a lot of promise for fostering healthy relationships with people from religious traditions different than our own. The 3 rules of interfaith engagement, and I will be tackling these in order, are as follows. The first rule, always let other people of other religions define themselves. Never let their enemies do it for them. Second, never compare their worst to our best. And finally, develop holy envy. I will adopt and adapt these 3 rules for interfaith engagement as a framework for reaching out to and building healthy relationships with Muslims. I believe these rules offer a great first step for Christians who want to cultivate genuine friendships and relationships with Muslims, but they don't know where to start. These rules help us assume the best of our Muslim neighbors at a time in which we are encouraged into all too many quarters, and often with malice and dishonesty, to assume the worst of our Muslim neighbors. So let me tackle each of these 3 rules of interfaith engagement very briefly, and then we'll open this up for a conversation. So the first rule from Stendhal that I want to adapt to this particular context of Christian-Muslim relations is this: allow people of other religions to define what their religion means to them. I often paraphrase the rule this way: learn from a religion's practitioners, not from its enemies. It's easy for Christians in America to take for granted our ability to define what Christianity means for us and to define that for the larger public. That's because Christians are in the majority. Just short of 70% of the US population is Christian. Christians control the White House. Christians control Congress. Christians control the US Supreme Court, where they dominate it. The majority of governorships and state legislators are dominated by Christians. Christians have power in the United States, and white Christians in particular have power, lots of it. And with that power comes the capacity to control the narrative of Christianity. This is not the case for our Muslim neighbors. Muslims, on the other hand, make up scarcely 1% of the US population, and they have ongoing challenges in defining how the rest of us understand Islam. Muslims don't dominate political institutions or oversee powerful media outlets in America. And in that respect, they are relatively powerless to control the narrative. This problem is exacerbated by the fact that there is a powerful and well-funded Islamophobia industry that doesn't want Muslims to tell their stories on their terms. People like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Frank Gaffney, and others go out of their way to demonize Muslims and to present themselves as the voice of what Islam really is and to present themselves as experts in Islam. And over the past decade, these once fringe figures have really moved to the center of American political discourse in terms of defining what Islam is or how it should be understood. They, again, are part of this industry that we in my field call the Islamophobia industry, and its influence is vast. It extends to the broader population. In fact, it's not uncommon for someone to attend one of my public lectures and either invoke stereotypes or employ tactics popularized by this very industry. So in some instances, this takes the form of, let's say, some random guy, if I were to show up at the St. Andrew Church there, and some random guy in the congregation might stand up, and during the Q&A section that follows, he'll try to discredit everything I've just said about Islamophobia. And one of the ways he does this is he will open up his copy of the Quran, which he just so conveniently has brought with him, and he will open it up to a specific passage known as the sword verse, and he will read it out as proof of Islam's violence. The verse reads as follows: "Wherever you encounter idolaters, kill them." He will then smile at me and the audience present, close the Quran that he's brought with him, and tell everyone that this is how he knows why Islam is violent and dangerous. He has read their book, and he knows how to interpret it, right? This is an excellent example of allowing the enemies of Islam to define it and not Muslims themselves. It's something that most Christians in America would never stand for. Most Christians that I know of would show no patience for someone who is not Christian, but would show up to a church, open up the Bible, read the passage from the 6th chapter of Ephesians that says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling," close the Bible and say, now they know what Christianity is all about, that this is a religion that promotes slavery, right? This point should be obvious, but I find it be worth making anyway. If you want to know how Christians understand the Bible, including this verse from Ephesians, you don't ask people who hate Christianity, you ask Christians. You read the Bible with and alongside Christians. If I am not a Christian, but I want to understand how Christians understand that slavery passage in Ephesians, or frankly, any passage from the Bible for that matter, I should ask other Christians. I should ask Christians how they understand their own sacred text. In fact, I have a moral obligation to ask Christians and not to assume that I know all there is to know about Christianity, because I picked up the holy book of Christianity and I read one verse, closed it, and I drew my own preconceived notions and conclusions about it. All of this applies to Muslims as well. If Christians want to understand how Muslims interpret the sword verse or any other passage from the Quran, we should ask Muslims. We should read the Quran with and alongside our Muslim neighbors and try to see Islam's most sacred text through Muslim eyes. You don't ask the random guy who hates Islam to explain the Quran to you, any more than you ask some rabid anti-Semite to explain the Torah to you. You let Muslims define themselves, you let Jews define themselves, you let Mormons define themselves, you let Buddhists define themselves, and of course you expect Christians to define themselves. And that's just the foundational rule of interfaith engagement, right? If Christians were to follow this one rule alone, irrespective of what I'm about to say in the other two rules, we would see a significant shift, I think, in the effort to combat Islamophobia. So that's the first rule. Never allow the enemies of a religious tradition to define that religion. Allow practitioners of that religion to define it for themselves. The second rule of interfaith engagement is never to take the worst examples of another religion and compare them to the best of ours. Never compare their worst to our best. Christopher Stendahl once noted that most of us are actually quite narcissistic when it comes to our own religion. We think of it at its best while noticing only the flaws and the failures of other religions. The temptation for Christians to look to our best and compare it to the worst of Islam is particularly strong when it comes to the topics of peace and violence. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone ask, well, where is the Muslim Martin Luther King? It's usually not a serious question, it's a rhetorical question. The assumption that Islam doesn't have a Martin Luther King. It only has Osama bin Laden and people like him. It doesn't have peacemakers like we have in Christianity. But the question, rhetorical as it is also a deliberate attempt to portray Islam in the worst possible light. It's an attempt to compare Christianity's best with Islam's worst. That's not only a theological low blow, it's unethical. It's theological, if not interfaith malpractice. The truth is all religions have their share of scoundrels and villains. And I assure you, I could give an entire different presentation on the scoundrels and villains in the history of Christianity. There are plenty of them that can fill volumes of books. So Christianity is really no different than Islam or any other religion in this regard. On the other hand, all religions, all of them have their share of peacemakers. And if Christians want to know whether Islam has peacemakers, we don't have to really dig all that deeply to find examples. I usually encourage Christians to start with recent Nobel Peace Prize winners, people like Muhammad Yunus or Tawakkol Karman or Malala Yousafzai, all of whom have won the Nobel Peace Prize in the past 2 decades, all of whom point to Islam as their source of inspiration for their efforts to create a more just, more peaceful world. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are phenomenal people throughout the world, from Afghanistan and Iraq to South Africa, to here in the United States. I have friends here in the United States, such as Ibu Patel of the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago, who has done pioneering work on interfaith engagement on college campuses. In Minnesota, where you're at right now, my good friend Jelani Hussein, who is the executive director of the Minnesota chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, is someone who works tirelessly to promote civil rights for Muslims and other religious minority communities, and who has been at the center of organizing grassroots responses to the death of George Floyd. All of these individuals and many, many more look to Islam as their source of inspiration. They see their work to educate the public, to build bridges between religions, to fight for civil rights. All this is an extension of their Islamic faith. It's not in spite of their Islamic faith, it's because of it. It's how they understand what it means to live their lives as Muslims. These and many other Muslims whose names don't make the news represent the best of Islam. And it's the best of Islam that deserves much more attention from Christians as we reach out to our Muslim neighbors. So that's the second rule of interfaith engagement, right? Not to compare their worst with our best. Compare like with like, apples to apples. The third and final rule of interfaith engagement I want to touch on before we have a conversation is phrased by Stendahl in a very creative way as trying to develop or cultivate something he calls holy envy towards other religions. The idea behind this rule is to discover some element within other religions that evokes beauty and a sense of awe and wonder. This, frankly, is not a small feat when you think about it. After all, the world's religions seemingly have been at odds with one another for many centuries. Many of us have not, in our religious upbringings and our houses of worship where we've been formed, we've not been encouraged to look for the beauty in other religious traditions. So to develop holy envy toward another religion requires fighting against the impulses to diminish other religions at the expense of our own religion. It also requires us to recalibrate our spiritual radars so that we are more in tune, much more in tune to that which is beautiful and awe-inspiring in other religions. And this, frankly, just takes practice. It doesn't happen overnight. It also takes a heck of a lot of humility and a willingness to see other religions not as competitors or as enemies, but as sources of wisdom and insight. If we want some good examples of Christians who have articulated holy envy for Islam in the past, we could look at two former presidents, one on each side of the political spectrum, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, without any other running commentary on my part about the politics and policies of either president. I can point to instances in both of these figures in which they have articulated a version of holy envy. George W. Bush once noted that how the practice of fasting during Ramadan, which we're about to end right now, how the practice of fasting is really inspiring to him. He was in awe of the discipline and commitment from Muslims who observe the practice of fasting, particularly in a culture in which they're surrounded by people during the month of Ramadan, for example, who weren't fasting. President Obama, formerly when he was running for the presidency back in 2007, he told the New York Times in an interview that the Islamic call to prayer is, quote, one of the prettiest sounds on earth at sunset. The call to prayer, mind you, is not part of Obama's Christian heritage, but it clearly is a sound that moves his spirit deeply. He is in awe of the call to prayer and the beauty it contains. As for me, there's a lot about Islam that as someone who's not Muslim, that I've come really to appreciate over the years. But if I had to name one thing that inspires the most holy envy for me, it's the practice of 5 daily prayers. This wasn't really always the case. I come from a Protestant Christian background, like many of the people tuning in tonight. Protestant Christians historically have been suspicious of religious practices that come across as mandatory. So as a much younger man, I imagined that Islam's observance of 5 daily prayers came across to someone like me as a burdensome list of things to do, right? As a works righteousness sort of thing. I had trouble seeing the beauty in it. But after many years of developing friendships with Muslims and observing Muslims at prayer on many occasions, I've changed my tune considerably. I've developed deep admiration for the 5 daily prayers that Muslims observe. And part of this is because I really admire the embodied nature of Muslims at prayer. Many Protestant Christians tend to encourage disembodied relationships with the divine. Worship, including prayer in many Protestant communities, is something that often is believed to take place primarily from the neck up, right? Something that takes place up here. But Muslims invest their whole bodies in prayer as they prostrate themselves and touch their head to the ground in submission to their creator. It's a beautiful, beautiful sight to behold when Muslims are doing this, and they're doing this in unison. And it's a powerful reminder to me that the entire human body is a spiritual conduit connecting us to the divine. It's not just the neck up that does this. What I also admire is how the frequency of the prayers in Islam results in an infusion of the sacred into the secular. The most ordinary routine of days do not pass without Muslims regularly pausing to plug into the ground of their being and to recharge their spiritual batteries. The prayers provide a sacred ordering to daily life that is, I think, all too often missing from the lives of many Christians, and particularly Protestant Christians. Now, I should say as one caveat here, holy envy, as Snindall coined this phrase, it's not a ploy to appropriate elements of Islam or any other religion for that matter, and then make them our own. It's not this sort of stealth attempt to steal something from Islam and baptize it as Christian. This is not about spiritual plagiarism, but it is an opportunity for Christians to find beauty and to seek wisdom, to seek awe within Islam, and through this beauty, this wisdom, and this awe, to develop an appreciative knowledge of Islam that opens the door to deeper dialogue and more meaningful relationships. So those are the 3 roles of interfaith engagement that I think are quite promising as an initial blueprint for Christians who are seeking to do better. by their Muslim neighbors, to be more honest with them in terms of truth telling, and to be more neighborly. These three rules, again, are to first let people of other religions define themselves, let Muslims define their own religious tradition, don't let their enemies do it for them. Second, never compare the worst of another religion with our best. In this case, don't compare the worst of Islam with the best of Christianity. Compare apples to apples, like to like. And finally, learn to develop holy envy. In this case, holy envy, a sense of awe and beauty and wonder that a Christian can encounter within Islam when they engage Muslims. What I love about these rules is that I think they put Christians on the right track when it comes to moral commitments towards Muslims. All three rules encourage, and frankly, I think they require, that we engage Muslims honestly and with respect for how Muslims understand and practice their own religion. The three rules illustrate what Christians call the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in doing so, they also illustrate a famous teaching from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he says, none of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Taken together, the rules provide a solid foundation for interfaith engagement that enables Christians to assume the best of our Muslim neighbors. They also encourage us to develop a genuine curiosity about Islam as it is understood and experienced and lived by Muslims, and to move beyond a mere repetition of caricatures and stereotypes that are so prominent these days and that have been disastrous in terms of policies and practices targeting Muslims, sometimes with horrific, violent, and if not deadly consequences. These rules of interfaith engagement require us to change positions, to assume the role of student, with Muslims as our teachers, with Muslims as our guides when it comes to understanding Islam. And when we do this with greater interfaith understanding, I hope comes greater empathy. This is what we need, frankly, now more than ever, if our pluralistic society has any chance of surviving, let alone thriving in these perilous times. We need a revolution of empathy. In case of our Muslim neighbors, we Christians need to imagine ourselves in the shoes of our Muslim neighbors and to try to see Islam from their perspective. More broadly, we need to take more time to learn how Muslims read and interpret their own text, live out their own traditions, and tell their own stories. Only then will we know what it means to tell truths about Muslims. Only then will we be able to love our Muslim neighbors as ourselves, and only then will we have the capacity to tap into the riches and wisdom Muslims offer as we collectively work for a more peaceful and prosperous nation and world. Those are my remarks in terms of the three rules of interfaith engagement, and I certainly want to have an opportunity now for questions or commentary or insights. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Todd, for beginning us here. I also wanted to just remind everyone who's joining at home that you can text message your questions. I, in fact, have my phone right here, so I will get those questions in, and Todd will be able to respond to them. I thought that I would start at least with a couple of my own questions to get us going, but would love for you to be sending those questions in, and we'll keep those going into the conversation. So thank you again in ending with this really hopeful imagination for all of us that we really need a revolution of empathy. I think that's such a great line. In the past several weeks of this course, we'll call it, these sets of conversations, we've been starting in kind of concentric circles, Todd, learning about ourselves first as Lutheran Christians, and then maybe a little bit more broadly as Christians in North America, and then as Christians within a global context, and now as we're kind of shifting into kind of interfaith understanding and where we sit in a broader context. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to kind of help us wonder about how do we create those connections or relationships with our Muslim neighbors? You know, you mentioned, like you said, Todd, that that Minnesota has a vibrant Muslim community and much to do with Lutheran heritage of resettlement and refugee resettlement because of our tradition of assisting in immigration. But how might you recommend to people living here in Eden Prairie, which has a growing and robust Muslim population, how might we build connections where we might not see them to begin with? What advice might you give to folks?
Yeah, great practical question. Like, how do you actually do this instead of talking about it, right? Well, I can think of this in two different ways. One is using churches and mosques, in terms of houses of worship as sort of a home base to do this work. And another way is to do this out in the community through a commonly identified goal. On the first one, I would say, you have plenty of Muslim communities and organizations in Minnesota, and particularly in the Twin Cities, that are very open to and inviting of people from outside to engage with them, to visit them during Eid celebrations, which we're about to have tomorrow at the end of Ramadan, or other kinds of open house endeavors. And identifying those mosques can be very key in terms of a first step. Trying to find Muslim communities who would like to partner in educational endeavors. One creative way to do this would be to have a Quran study hosted by the Lutheran Church, and a study of the New Testament that would be hosted by a mosque, right? Or in some variation that where Christians and Muslims together read and study and discuss their sacred texts together. And you could do this in other ways in terms of visiting one another, in terms of sacred occasions, worship services, that sort of thing. So there are all sorts of ways that churches and mosques themselves can serve as conduits for this type of relationship building. I know of one church in a suburb of Minneapolis some years ago that had an interfaith sort of gathering. They had me speak at this sort of interfaith gathering, but they did this in the fellowship hall, and they ended up having people get mixed together, Muslims and Christians at the tables in the fellowship hall, and then encourage them to actually follow up with one another, the people sitting at their table, for inviting them to dinner at their own homes, right? So this little fellowship gathering where you have the speaker come in ended up being the beginning of efforts for Muslims and Christians who were in this fellowship hall to actually, outside the fellowship hall, invite one another over for dinner, right? But this is key in terms of the building of relationships, right? You get to know human beings in a very intimate sort of way. It can also happen outside churches and mosques in a formal sense by identifying common issues that you're passionate about. So Pastor Matthew, you mentioned a while ago, refugee resettlement, right? Well, there's a lot of that in Minnesota. Of course, it's very controversial. It's often very politicized. You don't need me to come in and tell you how politicized that can be in the state of Minnesota. And it gets a lot of national attention, particularly during presidential election cycles. But you have Lutheran organizations that are very much involved in this resettlement work, and not only just resettlement, but acclimation to this new environment for refugees, many of whom will maybe have a Muslim background. And Lutherans have this own history in the region as well, doing this work, if not in some cases, tracing their ancestry back to people who also settled in this region. But if refugee resettlement, refugee rights is your passion, that could be a common cause that Lutherans can find with Muslims in Minnesota and the Twin Cities in your case, and find ways to build coalitions around that. The rationale behind both of these ideas is the idea that is something in the social sciences we call intergroup contact theory, that building relationships reduces prejudice. And the data is pretty consistent. If I'm Christian and I know someone who's Muslim, I'm much less likely to be Islamophobic. If I know someone who's Jewish, if I have a personal relationship with someone who's Jewish, I'm much less likely to be anti-Semitic. But built into that theory is a notion that these relationships that you foster across, in this case, religious traditions, work best when you identify some sort of common cause, something both communities can rally behind. And that would be the way I would encourage any church and any Christian community to go about doing this work. There are lots of ways you can find common cause with Muslim communities. Once you identify those, try to find ways to partner in making them happen in your own community. And you will find that those relationships will be much easier to forge, and the trust and the reciprocity will be there as well, which is key to building these relationships.
That's really helpful, Todd. Thank you so much. And I would even perhaps add one for our own Eden Prairie community. I think one of the places where this intergroup contact, like you shared, Todd, is happening and perhaps is most robust as is within our schools, that our children, white children and East African Muslim children, for example, are interacting in class and in schools. Parents are serving in lunchrooms together, even in neighborhood walks. That we are encountering our neighbors in really kind of some shared interest of how our community can serve our children in the best ways. That perhaps that would even be an easier way, or a really easy way to kind of connect on some shared hopes and dreams with our Muslim neighbors of how can our schools serve all of our children. And that question, I think that would really resonate with a lot of folks here. I do have a couple of questions coming in, more around the specifics of Islam. And what I'll say is I will ask every question that you send, but I'm also going to share that we intend to allow our Muslim neighbors to speak on their own terms. Dr. Green is a Christian pastor and scholar of Islamophobia, but we also have Pastor Peter, and who has served in Egypt for a number of years. Many of you know that, as bringing in Dr. Abdul Durdri, who is an imam who used to live in Eden Prairie, and we've formed a friendship with him over the years. Now he's living in Brooklyn Park, but he will be here next week. So I'm going to pass these questions along, but I also, if you'd like to kind of invite Dr. Durdri to respond, you're welcome to do that as well. So the first question that came in is, I heard at one time that Muslim women wear the headscarf as a sign of respect for the Virgin Mary. Is that true? Or if not, why do they cover their heads?
Yeah, it's an understandable question, particularly in Western societies where this practice may seem exotic, right? The question of why do Muslim women cover, assuming the Muslim women who do cover, not all Muslim women do. Not all Muslim women wear a hijab, for example. But for those who do, if you ask 20 different Muslim women why you wear the hijab, you might get 20 different answers. And it just simply points to the fact that this is there's a lot of diversity within Islam, including amongst Muslim women, that you ultimately need to be engaged in these conversations with Muslim women directly in order to understand the complexity of this issue. Certainly there's a teaching of modesty that runs pretty strongly in Islam, in terms of really both men and women, at least historically. But you also just simply have various historical reasons for why Muslim women wear the hijab. Why in some countries you've seen a resurgence of this. Egypt is a great example of a country that, back in the early mid 20th century, you would not have had as many Muslim women wearing the hijab as you end up having in the late 20th century onward, right? And there are larger political, cultural factors that are shaping those decisions. And what really interests me is, irrespective of the different interpretations Muslim women have of the hijab, I'm a big believer in freedom of religion and freedom of religious expression. And we should all be very concerned with other Western nations that target this. And you're seeing this a lot more in Europe, particularly, where there are laws passed. France has been the most extreme example, but you've seen this in other countries too. But laws are being passed targeting Muslim women in terms of regulating what they wear out in public. And I would neither want laws that require women to wear anything in particular, nor I want laws that prohibit women from wearing what they want to, right? But you're seeing that move in a lot of European countries as well, where Muslim women become sort of the battlefields in many ways of the larger question of Islam and its place in Western society. And that's the kind of conversation we want to be having, and we want to be really, really cautious with these issues in the United States, though I don't see the First Amendment being interpreted in that way in the United States anytime soon. But we certainly know other ways that Muslim women who wear the hijab can be targeted, including in hate crimes. They become very easy targets in hate crimes. And so there's all sorts of reasons why Lutherans and Christians should be very careful in the way that they engage with Muslims on this question, for sure. So I don't have an easy answer to the why question of the hijab, only because I know enough to know that there are way too many answers to that question, and they become very personal to many different Muslim women, not to mention that there are plenty of Muslim women who don't wear the hijab.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. Just to echo as well, I think there's some deep irony in in this belief in religious freedom that often the most staunch Christians will advocate for religious freedom for Christians, but perhaps not for Muslims. I really appreciate the way that you're speaking about calling each of us to advocate for religious freedom. Yes, for ourselves, but also for our interreligious neighbors. And that leads into this question that just came in. I think that your comments tonight apply to other religions as well, based on lack of knowledge, which can result in fear and mistrust. Do you agree? And perhaps you can share a little bit more about that.
Yes, in fact, the way I've sort of translated Krister Stendhal's rules specifically for the question of Christian-Muslim engagement. But Stendhal himself actually coined these rules really to apply across the board. And in short, I think they do apply across the board, irrespective of what your religious starting point is or the religious community or tradition you're engaged with. And to give an example, I can give an example from Stendhal himself. Stendhal was fascinated with Mormonism, the Mormon tradition, particularly with the practice of baptizing the dead. Now, this is a very controversial practice, I should say, the Mormon practice of baptizing the dead, having a member of the Mormon community serve as a proxy for someone who's already died. They're baptized as a way of incorporating a deceased person into the Mormon community. And some of those controversies are understandable, particularly when, say, people who died in the Holocaust are being baptized posthumously, right? Understandable why that would be controversial. But stepping back from that controversy and looking at the bigger picture, Stendhal was fascinated by the reverence that Mormons had for their dead and the way that they tried to connect to the dead. And frankly, this is true in some other religious traditions as well. And he wondered if Lutherans really did enough to connect with those who've gone before, beyond sort of the language of the communion of saints, but really ongoing rituals that had really tightened the conduit between heaven and earth, if you want to speak in those terms, right? Between those who've gone before us and those who are still alive. But you could do this in all sorts of other traditions as well. For me, I am fascinated by the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva for mourning, right? Am I envious of that in terms of holy envy when it comes to the way Jews collectively mourn together when someone has died, and I would love to have something similar without appropriating it, unfairly from Judaism, something similar in Christian traditions. So you can go on and on in terms of finding examples of how this would apply to other traditions or comparing their worst to our best, right? Which historically has been the case. Christians have done this for a long time in the United States with Jews, for example. Protestant Christians did this towards Catholic Christians in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of trying to cast Catholicism in its worst light, presenting Protestants in their presumably best light. So yes, this is certainly a mindset that you can apply to almost any religious tradition. So yeah, I would certainly encourage anyone to take these three rules and translate them more broadly in any sort of interfaith encounter.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting you mentioned that, and feel free to keep the questions coming in. When I don't see a question, I'm going to fill my own in, friends. So I can talk about this stuff. So just please keep them coming, but I'm going to jump in here with one of my own. You mentioned the example of Mormonism, and I was raised in a Christian tradition that actually cultivated not wholly envy of other traditions, but I believe that the tradition I grew up in cultivated fear of other religions, almost out of a sense of falling off of the bandwagon of Christianity, right? In fact, I'll get personal. I can remember a book that my mom had gotten that was this list of all of these different religious traditions and how to stay away from them. Basically, I mean, it was kind of stay away from these because it can lead you into some places that won't be in alignment with Jesus. And when you had mentioned Mormonism, I even felt it in my body still today. I mean, I'm far beyond this, but I even felt it like, but more. Can I really develop holy envy of our Mormon siblings? And yes, I can. And so how might you encourage or give us advice for those of us who are still doing that work of kind of untying those knots that are somehow in us that we need to be afraid of our our religious neighbors, because somehow it means that we'll be less of a Christian, or that it will somehow take away in our faith, and somehow. Yeah, help us out there, Todd.
That's a very difficult question. In fact, your work as a minister, that's a lot of what your work is about, right? And I'm sure in your congregation, you're not the only one who grew up, with that framework. I did too. I grew up in the Deep South in Mobile, Alabama. So I grew up in evangelical country. And I'll spare you all the details of my upbringing. Other than that, I really struggle with those kind of teachings. Preachings of hell and the damnation if you weren't Christian, but if you weren't the right kind of Christian, if you didn't sort of articulate the right kind of doctrine, or didn't in that case really have a born again experience. And in my case, I grew up just skeptical of that anyway. So what helped me, I think, is again the relationships. Going back to our first point, which is it's hard to harbor such animosity towards your religious neighbors if these are your next door neighbors and your work colleagues and your good friends, right? And you're collaborating with them in other ways. The more you have these relationships, the harder it is to see Jews, Muslims, Mormons, Buddhists, or whoever as abstractions. But yes, sadly, the fancy phrase that encapsulates what you're talking about, Pastor Matthew, is exclusivism, right? Many Christian communities have an exclusivist orientation. And that's just theological jargon for Christianity has exclusive rights to truth and the exclusive path to salvation. And if salvation is at the very top of the mountain, there's only one path up that mountain, and that's Jesus, as understood by my own particular Christian tradition. And there are no other paths up that mountain. But the more you interact with other religious communities and practitioners, and get to understand in a more in-depth, intimate way their own practices, their own moral commitments, the way they live their lives, you will start to see other paths up that mountain. And you'll start to be open, I hope at least. This is certainly something I believe strongly. You'll be open to the ways that the divine God, or whatever you want to call the ultimate being, is at work in these other traditions. And I'll go so far as to say, because of the Lutheran church that you're serving and the people are watching for tonight, that it helps if you develop theological resources within the Lutheran tradition that speak to this, right? Just as Catholics and other traditions have done as well, the Catholic tradition has some very powerful teachings when it comes to the presence of the divine within the human being. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s articulated this really powerfully. The idea that the Catholic who encounters a Buddhist is not encountering someone who's never experienced God. God is present in the depths of the being of their Buddhist neighbors. And so, and I won't get into a theological lecture, but there's a long theological trajectory at work there that Catholics and the Catholic Church is employing. And I would love to see Lutheran churches and Presbyterian churches and Methodist churches and others draw from organic resources within their tradition in order to find ways to speak to this phenomena of finding truth and value and wisdom, and being open to the question of quote unquote salvation, right? Ultimate connection with the divine being, using the resources of the Lutheran tradition, whether that be a theology of grace or a theology of the cross or whatever, right? The resources are there, but we need more practice, developing that language in Lutheran traditions, I believe. But yes, I liken, this is not a perfect analogy, so bear with me, but I do liken it a bit to the significant changes in attitudes in the American population on LGBTQ issues. When I was growing up, of course, in the 70s and 80s, and even as a young adult in the 90s, there was still an awful lot of hostility, including, and it was enshrined in the political realm in terms of laws and legislation targeting LGBTQ individuals and communities. And something changed to the point where we still have plenty of bigotry today, but some of those laws got relaxed. There have been more significant changes, more prominent public figures coming from this community. And we can ask the question, why did attitudes change enough for that to happen? And I do believe that has to do with, it's easy to target with hostility someone who's part of the LGBTQ community when they're in an abstraction. But when that's your son or your daughter, your brother, or your sister, or your aunt, or your parent, or your best friend, your roommate in college, or whatever, right? When these are real human beings that you're connected with, it's hard to keep them as abstract issues And those personal relationships really do become game changers in terms of starting to see them in a very different light. And I think theologically, that's true as well when you talk about people outside the Christian tradition, that when they are no longer abstractions, but they are people with whom you have close relationships with. The idea that you can find wisdom in their traditions or insight from them becomes much easier to entertain than if you keep them at an arm's length. And that I interpret all the warnings I got, and it sounds like you got too, about staying away from people of different traditions. Part of what happens when you stay away from them is you can still demonize them. It's easy to demonize people you don't know.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you, Dr. Green. Question. Use the microphone, Nan, and if you wouldn't mind turning around. I know it's going to feel funny, but you should turn around and face the camera, and then it should be on.
Hello?
There we go. Turn around and face right back at Adam in the back, and then everyone can see you.
Okay, it's not really a question. It's just Steve and I are so hopeful. We're in our 60s, and we see young children, like you say, at Forest Hills and different schools that hold each other's hands, and they don't see different ethnic groups at all. They just love one another. It's just is very hopeful for us, and I know that that's a taught behavior for kids to see differences in other people. So I'm hoping that our generation, we're in our 60s, my parents, see different things, and I just think each generation we're learning more and more about togetherness and how important it is to, love one another and unconditional. And we didn't get to choose who our parents were, where we were born, all of those things, who we were born to. So I think the younger generation, our kids and our grandkids, I hope teach us someday.
Yeah.
That's Pastor Matthew's very young. He's teaching us all the time. So, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight.
Amen.
Good point. Two things there quickly. One, prejudice is taught. You don't come out of the womb with this kind of hostility, right? It's taught, and it's communicated through a variety of channels that we have to be very sensitive to and call attention to. And children are very promising in those regards, right? In a sense that they can sometimes just establish those relationships in ways that we as adults might have more difficulty with. And so we should look to people who are younger, and particularly to young children sometimes, to sort of look at models for how that can be done in certain contexts well. And the words we use that shape children, but shape all of us, right? For whatever reason, when you were talking, I saw this phrase from the late philosopher and civil rights activist, a Jewish philosopher named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously said, "Words create worlds." He was using that phrase to describe how the Holocaust came to be, right? The Holocaust didn't start with gas chambers. The Holocaust started with words, started with rhetoric. It started with people in positions of power with powerful microphones and platforms, casting Jews and amongst other communities as hostile enemies, as existential threats to the German nation. And when the rhetoric was doing that enough, and it sort of shaped the collective minds of many people in Germany, then you can open the door to the kinds of policies that we saw in the final solution, right? Words matter. The words we use create worlds. I certainly see this all the time with anti-Muslim rhetoric. It's why I'm so alarmed by it, why I seek to call it out, why I encourage Christians and others to call it out. The words that Christians use or politicians use, such as the phrase "Islam hates us," when a presidential candidate and later president uses language like that, those words are very damaging, and they can open the door to far worse things happening. Words create worlds. As soon as we have a certain mental world that such and such a community is an enemy and a threat to us, then we're going to be open to policies that target them with violence and far worse things in terms of war and death, not to mention other exclusionary and discriminatory practices. But words create other kinds of worlds too, right? Words matter. And for Christians, I ask, what words will we use as we talk about our Muslim neighbors? What worlds do we create? Should we create with our words, right? So the language we use in interfaith engagement matters. And because Christians are part of a power imbalance in the United States when it comes to this language, we need to be particularly careful and gracious with the words that we use to describe Muslims, to describe Islam, and to talk about our neighbors, because we are creating worlds, but what kind of worlds will we create? That's the question that we should wrestle with.
I've got another question, and if you've got just a few more minutes with us, Dr. Green, we'd love to have just a couple more questions. One that just came in, Christians believe salvation only comes through Christ. I believe that affects their attitudes toward other religions. Your thoughts? Question mark.
Yes, well, and first of all, I'm here. You've got me for more than a few minutes if you'd like. I'm enjoying the conversation. Second to this question, let me rephrase that from my perspective as a historian of religion. Many Christians historically have believed that Christianity is the only path to salvation and that Jesus Christ is the only path to salvation. That view, as I mentioned earlier, is called exclusivism. And yes, it was dominant for most of the history of Christianity until the modern era, with a few exceptions prior to the modern era. In the 20th century, from the mid-20th century onward, we've seen that view questioned a bit more in other circles, to the point that many mainline Protestant churches today and the Roman Catholic Church, at least in their more formal official teachings, would question whether Jesus is the only way to salvation, or at least more particularly whether one must be a Christian in order to achieve salvation or be reconciled with God. Yes, that's not been the historic view, but it's a view that has changed and developed in part because of the rapid globalization, mass communications, the blurring of borders, the fact that people from many different religious traditions are living much closer together in much closer proximity than ever. And again, the more these relationships develop, the more they change theological assumptions. And so we're seeing that in many Christian traditions as well. So you will find, for example, the Roman Catholic Church's official position in the Vatican teaching is one we would call inclusivism. That while Jesus Christ is God's ultimate self-communication to the world and disclosure to the world, the grace of Christ can be found embedded within religious practitioners of all sorts of different religious traditions, right? The Christian missionary need not bring Jesus to someone. They've already experienced the divine in the depths of their being, and therefore the precondition for salvation is already there. Again, without getting into a more sophisticated and a lecture, that's a way that the Catholic Church itself has been adapting in the mid-20th century onward to basically what we call pluralism, the reality of pluralism. So salvation has been one of the reasons, and the idea that only Christianity is the path to salvation has been a reason, certainly for the hostile attitudes toward people of other religious traditions. But that has been changing in some quarters in mainline Protestant churches, at least more official teachings in the Roman Catholic Church. And at least in the students I often teach, college students, most of them are even in more of a pluralistic camp, which is all religions are sort of equal paths to the divine or to the sacred. So you will find much more diversity of thought on this question than used to be. And with that comes different kinds of attitudes towards people of other religions. The question I can leave us on this particular topic would be, can we reconcile being an exclusivist Christian and believing Christianity is the only path to salvation with being kind and compassionate and sensitive towards Muslim neighbors? That's a question I ask. I wrestle with it a good bit. Can you reconcile exclusivism with viewing Muslims and Jews and others in terms of their full humanity? But without a doubt, historically, that's been a challenge.
That's really great. Many of you have heard me talk about kind of my working definition of Scripture. Most of what I teach around here is Bible. We're dipping our toes in some waters that's a little outside of my training, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Green's expertise today. But I often share that Scripture is our witness to the living voice of God. That's kind of my working definition of Scripture. And my choice of the word "our" is really important there. And I think you could use that in the same way, where we could say Jesus is our way to salvation, again, shared among Christians. And just notice how that kind of can reframe how we see our role in this great big world that God is at work in. And I always kind of come back to the Bible with some interesting examples, but I think, Dr. Green, about the example of the story of Abraham and Sarah, and then Abraham and Hagar, and how how God actually takes really wonderful care of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, where Hagar is willing to give up and watch her son die, but God actually saves this pair and makes of them a great nation. And in fact, Hagar is the first person in the Bible to give a name to God. I mean, that our own scripture is giving us imagination to see that God is at work in traditions outside of our own. So just kind of building off of that a little bit, Dr. Green, I'll ask, and if you want to comment on that, feel free, but I'll ask one final question of my own, since I get to ask a bunch of questions. You're saving them up for next week or something, but some of my kind of holy envy of Islam was developed around studying some of the Sufi, who are some of the mystic poets in Islam. I remember reading them in college, and I've always enjoyed poetry. But I'm wondering, in your advice, in kind of your tenet, to never compare the worst of our tradition with the worst of another's tradition with the best of ours. Give us kind of a greatest hits. Give us a list of things to read or to listen to, that we might immerse ourselves in some of the best of our Muslim neighbors. This is a congregation who loves to read, who loves to take in other things. So give us kind of your best hits list, so that we can maybe learn from the best of the Muslim tradition.
Right. Well, and this is very individualized to me, right? So you ask someone else this question, they might give you a very different list. But when I think of audiences like this, some of the examples I gave a while ago, right? These Nobel Peace Prize winners of the past 2 decades who have been Muslim, right? Oftentimes when you receive the Peace Prize, you get to give this really nice speech. These speeches are available online. And you get to see how they are making the connection in a number of these cases between their own tradition and the peace work that they've been doing. So that to me, again, Malala Yousafzai, who's also written a very famous book, who's given a lot of speeches, they're all available online. Those are texts that you can read, right? Tawakal Karman as well, another Muslim who's won the Nobel Peace Prize. Muhammad Yunus, who's done some extraordinary work in Bangladesh and other places in terms of microfinancing. Again, and drawing on certain Islamic teachings when it comes to the charging of interest, and basically what we take for granted in capitalism, right? But he's trying to find another way, and that works in other contexts. But in terms of the United States, when I bring it closer to home, I still look to Malcolm X, who I mean, amongst many white Christians in my experience, is always deemed with a lot of suspicion. But if you really delve more deeply into Malcolm X's writings, you're going to find this is a very sophisticated person who's got some very sophisticated views, not just on religion, but on race and race relations that we would do well to this day to heed. And so reading Malcolm X, listening to more Malcolm X would be a great place to start. My friend Ibu Patel that I mentioned earlier has written several books, which from the perspective of his Muslim faith, he engages on the questions of religious diversity and pluralism. He's a big believer in it. What I love about Patel is that he's also quite well-versed. He's a bit humble about it, but he's quite well-versed in many other religious traditions. So as a Muslim, he can engage fairly well in conversations, deeper conversations with Christians and Christianity, Jews and others. And he does such a good job of finding sort of common parallels across the board there too. So I love encouraging people to read people like Ibu Patel. And if you're looking for pop culture figures in say the last 50 years, I can't think of a better one to look to and to listen to, particularly if you can find interviews with him on this topic, than Muhammad Ali, the late boxer who converted to Islam, of course, many of you might know, in the 1960s in the context leading up to the Vietnam War. But Muhammad Ali is, again, this is someone who's considered to be a role model for so many people and has been for the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century. But, a lot of his own inspiration comes from Islam. So it's not just about reading books, it's about looking to figures that we admire. Ibu Patel has made this point with Jews, and the difficulty Jews initially had making it into the mainstream or trying to at least become more widely accepted in America. And what if anything starts to change in the mid 20th century, and you have Jewish actors and Jewish comedians, people that non-Jews can start to relate to, and they see on the screen, they see in other contexts, and this this puts a different kind of face on Jews than the caricatures and the stereotypes from anti-Semitism that were so prominent. But Patel also points to people like Sandy Koufax, the baseball player, right? These, Americans kind of worship athletes, for better or for worse, that happens. But when you have people like Sandy Koufax, that again, people who are not Jews, and maybe who historically had historically negative attitudes towards Jews, start cheering on, right? It can be a game changer as well. And so looking to other kinds of icons and actors and other people, I think is very helpful here as well. I'm sure I could send you a long list of books and that sort of thing, but I'm just trying to think of very accessible people that are pretty easy to find on the internet and or pretty easy to find their books somewhere, or they have videos or interviews or things like that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for spending this time with us this evening. We're so grateful to learn from you, to help us assume the best of our Muslim neighbors, to help us be really grounded in our own Christian faith understanding, and how we might become the best neighbors that we can be, to cultivate this revolution of empathy that you are inviting us into. I also wanted to add a shameless plug, as I often do, but we're actually going to be practicing some of this in a book study that we're beginning in just a couple of weeks in the pastor's book study on Thursday mornings, where we'll be learning, where we'll be reading the New Testament from a New Testament scholar who just happens to be Jewish. We'll be reading about Jesus' parables from Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jewish New Testament scholar who teaches in the Bible Belt in the South. So I think it will be a refreshing, but perhaps help us cultivate or overhear and see the holy envy of someone else from a different tradition, looking at our own sacred texts as we read the parables together. So once again, just thank you, Dr. Green. We're really grateful for your time tonight. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and best wishes on the study as you move forward. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And a farewell to everyone. We'll see you next week. Pastor Peter will be taking the stage, the table with a dear friend, Dr. Abdul Durduri. And so I invite you really to bring your questions about our Muslim neighbors. We will invite them to speak for themselves next week, not for the whole community, because that's also a really helpful stance for us to take, but for themselves. We'll learn about the practiced faith. And I know Pastor Peter is always a helpful guide with a master's in Islamic studies and countless years spent in both the Holy Land as well as Egypt, working in development and missions work there. So you will be in great hands next week. Thanks for being with us tonight, and you can always go back and watch earlier presentations on our YouTube channel. But we will see you again. Thanks for being with us. Have a good night.